One of the hottest new trends this summer is a superfood for your plants. It's yeast fertilizer. Does this fertilizer really work? Does it make your plants grow better? Does it contain all the nutrients your plants need? Let's have a closer look at this. So what is yeast fertilizer? Well, it's basically yeast that's been allowed to rise. Pretty much the same process as you would for making bread. So a very popular recipe is to take 1 pack of yeast or 1 teaspoon of yeast, add a teaspoon of sugar, 1 cup of warm water, and then let it sit for 3 hours. And the yeast will start to rise and grow and use up the sugar. At the end of the process, you take that mixture and you mix it with 5 cups of water, and that's your fertilizer. You now use that to water your house plants and out in the garden. Water those plants as well. Now, I checked the internet and I looked at several people's recipes, and guess what? They're all different. Everybody claims their recipe is best, but you know what? Not one person gave any kind of data to show that their recipe is great. In fact, they don't even present data that would indicate their recipe actually worked. They just make stuff up and post it on the internet. A red flag for me is that a lot of people will tell you to dilute this material even more if you're taking it outside to water your plants there. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Your plants out there are growing in a lot more soil, and to give them the same nutrients, we should actually be using a more concentrated formula. Anyways, let's let the data speak for itself. What is the best yeast recipe? Does the recipe make a difference? Not really. The total amount of nutrients in the mixture comes from the starting yeast, and a tiny bit comes from the water. Sugar has no plant nutrients, and the growing yeast does not create more as it grows. Neither baker's yeast nor soil-based yeast fixes nitrogen. Since nutrients are not created during the yeast growth phase, the actual method used to make the mixture does not really matter. The total amount of nutrients depends on the amount of yeast used. Is yeast a fertilizer? A fertilizer is legally defined as having reasonable amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Anyone who suggests this as a fertilizer should be able to give you the NPK value. Since gardening sites don't provide this kind of information, they have no idea if their mixture is a fertilizer or if it is useful for plants. I did find a study done in Egypt that tested yeast extract and provided nutrient data. Unfortunately, they don't provide details of how they made this extract, except to say it was a mixture of dry yeast, sugar, and water. After activating the yeast, it was then frozen and thawed twice to disrupt the yeast cells and release the nutrients inside. The recipes used by home gardeners skip this step, and so the nutrients inside the cells will be released more slowly. The yeast extract in this study has an NPK of 7, 0.4, 0.8. This was then diluted to produce the final fertilizer, which had an average NPK of 0.04, 0.002, 0.004. For comparison, a Miracle-Gro 24 or 816 diluted for houseplants has a final NPK of 0.024, 0.008, 0.016, which is the ideal ratio for plants. The yeast fertilizer has enough nitrogen, but is low in phosphorus and potassium. It does have low levels of some micronutrients. You can use it as a nitrogen source, but for an ideal fertilizer, you'll have to augment it with phosphorus and potassium from another source. There is a lot of talk about yeast biostimulants and PRGs, or plant growth regulators, improving plant growth. Yeast fertilizers do contain compounds like amino acids and vitamins, but so does just about every organic material. There is nothing special about the ones found in yeast, nor are the amounts particularly high. What does science say? A comprehensive review of yeasts as biofertilizers from 2021 had this to say. The use of yeast as PGPMs, plant growth promoting microorganisms, has not been extensively investigated. Most of the studies that do exist have focused on yeast found in soil, not baker's yeast. One study found that spraying apricot trees with yeast increased the weight of fruit produced, but not as much as an organic fertilizer spray. Spraying pea plants with yeast in sandy soil increased the total number of pods by 1/2 pod per plant, not a significant increase for gardeners. I did not find a study that tested the baker's yeast fertilizer used by gardeners. Is yeast better for some kinds of plants? The compounds produced by yeast include biostimulants and nutrients. These generally have similar effects on all plants. If yeast fertilizer works on some plants, it probably works on all plants. There is also a claim that the above yeast mixture will protect plants from various diseases, such as blight and fungal infections. Yeasts typically do not produce any toxic metabolites, which makes it less likely that they attack pathogens. However, special strains of baker's yeast have been found to produce toxic proteins that degrade the outer cell wall of competing yeast. These were causing havoc in the beer industry. Yeasts, like all microorganisms, compete with other organisms, including plant pathogens, for nutrients and space. This is probably the main way in which they compete. They also colonize plant surfaces, especially in damaged areas, where the plant is most prone to infection by pathogens. As they grow, they remove nutrients, making it harder for pathogens to grow. Although yeasts have the potential to protect plants from disease, few commercial products use them for this purpose, and there is no research to show that a spray of baker's yeast will reduce pathogens on plants. Does yeast fertilizer work? Well, it really depends on how you want to ask the question. Does it work? Well, yes, it does. Yeast contains nutrients. We know that if we add nutrients to plants, they will grow better. Yeast is just another type of organic material. But let's ask a different question. Is yeast fertilizer any better than other types of organic fertilizer? Or is it better than synthetic fertilizer? And the answer there is no. There's nothing special about the nutrients in yeast fertilizer. There are no magic ingredients in this stuff. It's no better than other types of organic fertilizer. It does, however, have one benefit over others, like fish fertilizer. It smells a lot better. If you have some extra old yeast lying around, go ahead and use it. But I wouldn't go out of your way to make this concoction. Use real fertilizer for your plants, and they'll grow much better. Now, if you'd like to find out what the best fertilizer is for your plants, have a look at this video here. And if you're interested in myths about organic fertilizer, you gotta watch this right here. Happy gardening.